Hi, it's Daniel Priya here, and today we're going to be talking about the London system. And I'm going to show you why it's one of the best opening choices that you can make, whether you're a beginner all the way to expert, or even if you're a title player. And I've been playing the London system for about 10 years now. I've played that pretty much at a lot of different levels. I've played that in friendly games, online games, even tournament games, and I have some pretty good games against top players, including grandmasters and a lot of title players. And I'll be showing some of these games in some other videos. What we're going to be doing today is we're really going through the fundamentals. So if you're a beginner, if you are an intermediate player, even an expert, this is exactly for you. And if you're a stronger player, this is a good way to really once again go through the fundamentals, and then you may want to go a little bit deeper if you want to play that against strong title players as well. If you are a beginner, there's actually a lot of advantages when it comes to choosing this opening over other openings. So let's understand why. So first of all, for the ones who don't know, the London system is a combination of d4, bishop f4, and usually it's played in a certain way. So for example, if we just make some simple moves like d4, d5, bishop f4, which is not the only move order, we'll cover that in just a moment. Let's say black just plays natural with knight f6, we go knight f3, e6, e3, and once again, don't pay too much attention to move order right now. This is just a way to really show you the idea. Let's say black goes bishop e7, we go knight b d2, and this is the key starting position of the London system. This is what white is aiming for, and in a moment we'll understand exactly why. But let's go back, let's go one step back and analyze that move by move. Now, why is it so important that the London system is an opening where you can actually play following ideas rather than having to memorize a lot of force and variations and stuff like that? So if you are a player who doesn't play chess full time, maybe you have a job, maybe you have a family, maybe you have a life outside chess, then maybe you can't really spend a lot of time learning a lot of different openings. So if you're a d4 player against d5, for example, which is only one of the possible replies for black, you have to learn, say for example you play c4, which is by far considered the main line. You have to learn the system against the orthodox with e6, and say you want to play with the very obvious knight c3, then here black can play bishop e7, black can play knight f6, black can play c6, and these systems can actually be very different from each other. Also, the stone wall with f5 is possible. That's already a lot of completely different openings. So for example, if black plays the stone wall, usually white fianchettos this bishop. If black plays bishop e7, usually white takes on d5. If black plays something like c6, there are lines with e4, extremely sharp lines. If black plays knight f6, then maybe you keep the tension in the center. So there's so many different type of positions that you have to learn, and that's only against d5. So if we take another step back, if black does not play d5, black can play knight f6, g6, d5, the Grunfeld defense. Maybe black can play king Indian, the king's Indian with d6, the Benoni, the Queen's Indian. So there's so many different openings that black can play, and white's play is extremely different. So that means that you actually need to spend a very long time studying all these sort of openings. However, if you do play the London system, you will likely transpose into variations that are kind of similar. Yes, of course, there's some differences. Black may or may not play d5, black may or may not play c5, but after all, you always developing the bishop to f4, which gives the game some sort of familiar character, and it'll be a lot easier for you to navigate the possible complications. As a matter of fact, contrary to openings like the Sicilian defense, or maybe some other gambits, some other aggressive lines, this is the type of opening where you don't really have massive risks in the opening. So you don't really risk to get checkmated in the opening. Even if you're a beginner, you will probably not be checkmated in the opening because everything is so safe. d4, look, this pawn on d4 is defended by the queen. If you start, for example, with e4, now this pawn is unprotected. So it's already a different game. This pawn on f2 is slightly weaker. There's the potential attack for black against this pawn, but by playing d5, this diagonal is shut down, so actually the king is extremely safe in the London system. So that's one of the main reasons why it's a great choice. The fact that there's not a lot of theory, certainly there's been more and more theory in the last few years, but the type of theory is not the type of theory that you absolutely need in order to play an opening. If you don't know the theory in the Knight Earth, in the King's Indian, you just lost. There are some openings where if you don't know the theory, you just can't even get a playable game. But in the London system, if you don't know the theory, maybe you will not get an advantage, but you will still get a playable game. And that's an extremely important concept. So it's very, very hard to get in deep trouble in the opening in the London system. Now, if you add a little bit of study, then you will be able to actually create troubles to your opponent. And that's why we're studying this. Now, let's start from the beginning, really move by move. And now, if you already played the London system, maybe some of it will look a little bit basic for you, but in reality, what we're doing is to step back and analyze the fundamentals. So after d4, what's really happening in the position? After we play this move d4, a lot of things can happen. It's just the first move. We don't know what's going to happen, but there's one thing that we know. And the one thing that we know is this pawn on d4 will never, ever get back to d2. Not even to d3, because pawns can't move back. So the fact that this pawn is already on d4 means something. And what it means is that we have already weakened some squares. Now, it may sound a little strange to some of you, like, wait a minute, we're advancing. Are you saying that we have weakened our position? In a way, yes. Every time we move a pawn, we're weakening some squares. And which squares are we weakening? e3 square, slightly weakened. c3 square, slightly weakened. The e4 square, significantly weakened. And the c4 square is also weakened. Now, why is the e4 square the most important of these ones? So if you look at these squares, now the e3 square can no longer be defended by the d pawn, but it's still defended by another pawn, so that's okay. The c3 square can no longer be defended by the d pawn, but is still defended by the b pawn. Let's look at these two squares. The c square, the c4 square, is no longer defended or potentially defended by the pawn on d3. But okay, white can play b3 and defend. However, on e4, the only way now to defend this e4 square is to play f3. And f3 is usually a very weakening move. It weakens this diagonal, it weakens the king. So it's extremely important to understand that after playing d4, we are really weakening the square e4. At the same time, look at this. We are grabbing space in the center, and we are creating some potential outposts in the future. So in the future, this square on e5 can become really strong, and sometimes this square on c5 can also become really strong. So let's have a look at what black does. Now, there's really two ways for black to play this. I'm going to focus on the main move that is d5, and the other move is knight f6. So today we're going to focus on d5. We'll cover knight f6 in another video. And after d5, let's have a look. What is black doing? Black is doing something very similar. So it's reinforcing this potential outpost on e4, and it's controlling c4 as well. But more importantly, these squares are slightly weakened, and in particular this e5 square. So after the first move from both players, we already know that the e5 square is potentially a very strong square for white. So playing bishop f4 immediately is a very, very principled way to play. We're immediately claiming this e5 square for us, saying, hey, the e5 square is our square, it's not your square, forget about it. And the fight around e5 is actually extremely important. So what's happening now that we just played bishop to f4? First of all, this bishop, by definition, is considered white's bad bishop. The reason it's considered that is because the central pawns are immediately fixed. So the d4 pawn is on a dark square. And this pawn is not really going to move anytime soon. So this bishop is the dark square bishop, which is the bishop of the same color as the square of white's central pawn, which means it's considered by definition the bad bishop. Now, if this bishop was behind the pawn chain, so if you put the bishop back just for a moment and play e3, as you can see, this bishop behind the pawn chain is actually not very active. It's just getting in the way of its own pawns, and the pawns are getting in the way of the bishop. It's not really ideal. But if we play this bishop outside the pawn chain first, now, okay, by definition, it's still a bad bishop, but at the same time, it's extremely active, controlling an important diagonal, in particular, is e5 square, as we just mentioned. The other thing that we're doing, once again, every time we make a move, we have to consider what the strength of that move is, but also if there's any potential drawback. And yes, we are weakening the b2 square, because the bishop here is defending b2, especially if we play something like e3, this bishop is no longer defending b2. Even if we don't play e3, you know what? This bishop is unlikely to go back to c1. So there's some potential to get in trouble on the b2 square, and this is something that we want to keep in mind. Now, black can continue in a number of different ways. The most popular is probably knight f6. So let's start with knight f6. We'll, of course, consider different move orders, but the beauty of the London system is that you can usually achieve a very similar setup against whatever system black chooses. So usually you will continue moves like e3, c3, knight b d2, knight f3, bishop d3, and castles. And the beauty of this system is that really, even if you come across a novelty, you don't really know what to do against it, maybe you will not play the best move, but simply by following the principles of the opening, you will be able to play a decent move and not get in trouble too soon. So let's look at, for example, once again, some very simple move by black. Black says, hey, you know what? Let me challenge the center immediately. So black, for example, plays c5. So that's a possibility. Now, if black plays c5, very, very simple. It's not the only move, but a very simple move you can play. c3, simply supporting the center right now. So supporting the center, and you creating this. A lot of people call this a number of different ways. It looks a little bit like a little house, but you can really call it different ways. Some people call it a hat or whatever you fancy, really. It's a very nice formation, like a pyramid. And the bishop is outside the pyramid, so outside the pawn chain, extremely active. So if you achieve this type of position, then all of a sudden, you know what? You can achieve this position against a number of different move orders. So for example, if instead of c5, black plays e6, you can go knight f3, and here c5, c3. Here you go, bishop e7, knight b d2, castles, bishop d3. You can continue just making the moves that you want to make. So let's go back to this particular position here. So we're supporting the center. Now, by supporting the center, something very important is happening as well. We're opening up this diagonal. Remember, we said that the b2 pawn is potentially weak. So we do need some way to defend this b2 pawn. And by playing c3, now this queen all of a sudden can go to c2, can go to b3. So in case of a queen b6, at some point, the queen can simply go to b3 and defend the b2 pawn. Queen c2, once again, is another way to defend. And keep that in mind, this wasn't possible before that. So for example, if c5 and we continue with a move like bishop e2, for example, a bishop d3, or even knight b d2, after queen b6, all of a sudden we cannot play c3 because the pawn here is attacked. We still have other ideas. We can play rook b1, for example, but the idea of playing c3 after black plays c5 is because the queen is ready to go and defend this b2 pawn. Now, what happens if black does something different and plays an early c5? We'll cover that a little bit later. Right now, we're really taking a step back once again and focusing on the basics. So in this particular position here, black has to make a very important decision. Is black going to shut down the light square bishop or play with the light square bishop outside the pawn chain? In general, solving this problem with the light square bishop is very, very critical for black. And if we consider normal variations of the queen's gambit, the reason, actually the number one reason why play c4 in this position is to make it harder for this bishop to be developed. And here the main variations are, for example, e6. This bishop is already shut down, so black's not even trying to develop the bishop early. Or maybe c6, and after c6 you may be thinking, all right, a bishop will go to f5 and everyone's happy, but in reality it's not so easy to actually develop that bishop. For example, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, if bishop f5, there is already some potential issue over b7. So the reason why plays an early c4 is to make it harder for black to develop this bishop. If we don't play c4 in the London system, you may be thinking, hey, so are we going to make it easy for black to develop that bishop? And the answer is not necessarily. It's not necessarily easy now for black to develop that bishop. First of all, because right now we still have the option of playing c4. So if black tries to play a quick bishop f5, for example, we can immediately play c4 and revert to that type of pattern. Now here, you can probably start with knight f3, and after e6, now the bishop can't even go back to defend. Now c4 is actually a very good move. And right now, there's actually some theory here to know if you want to play c4 in this position, because black could play bishop b1. It's a very concrete line, but it's really probably the only line that you need to study in order to play the system. And also, you're not really forced to play c4 right now. But after, again, this idea with c4, especially if black doesn't play bishop b1, then you immediately put in a lot of pressure with queen b3 against this pawn, and this is actually very, very comfortable for white. And if black does take on b1, then you're gonna take with the queen, and okay, you might get checked. So let's have a quick look. After bishop takes, queen takes, you might have to move the king to the center after this move like bishop b4 check. But there's actually a lot of ways for white to play. This king here is actually a lot safer than it looks. So at the end, you actually have the bishop pair in this position, and this king is not really in big danger. So that's a very interesting way to play this position as well. And if you don't like this type of positions, you can still stick to normal principles and play bishop d3. And okay, you are immediately exchanging the bad bishop for your good bishop, but you're actually getting a very nice lead in development. Because now you can castle immediately, and you can potentially develop a faster attack or a faster action on the queen side or in the center. And there's a third option as well. Some people have experimented with c takes d3 as well. So once again, there's many ways to get a very comfortable position, even if black tries to exchange that light square bishop early. The next thing that you want to consider is that in some lines, you can even harass this bishop. So maybe you want to play bishop e2, so you don't allow black to really exchange the bishop, and then you can continue with a potential g4. Now, you don't need to play g4 immediately. That's probably a little bit risky, but I'm just showing you the idea. So after you keep developing, you could continue. Maybe you can bring the knight to f3 and then to e5, and then go for a g4, h4, h5, and this bishop may actually get in trouble. So that's another idea to keep in mind as well. So usually black will not develop the bishop, because then black has to be prepared for all these different variations that are actually okay for white. So usually black will not attempt to do that, and black will even postpone e6 and keep the option open, or play e6 and shut down this bishop for the time being. And that means that after a move like e6, we already have our bad bishop outside the pawn chain, and black has got the bad bishop inside the pawn chain. So that's already an opening result, a very good opening result for white. Next, we can, for example, develop the knight. And again, there's a lot of subtleties based on when exactly to develop this knight. We will not cover all these nuances in this video. But right now, especially after black is playing e6, there's really no reason to postpone this knight advance. So a move like knight f3 is absolutely fine. And here black, again, can continue with a number of different moves. c5 is a very popular move. And with c3, we're reinforcing the center. Now, if black ever takes here, you can actually recapture both ways, but a very natural way to do it is with the e-pawn. And by recapturing with the e-pawn, we actually get more space for the bishop. So the bishop all of a sudden can actually go back if needed. If it's harassed by this knight, for example, the bishop can go back to e3. And after a move like e3, we can even increase the control over the e5 square by playing a later queen e2. So as we mentioned, this e5 square is one of the most important squares right now. And that's the result of black's first move, d5. After this, the knight on f3 is controlling e5, the pawn on d4 is controlling e5, the bishop on f4 is controlling e5. We can add the other knight from b1 to d2 to f3 in the future to support the other knight from f3 to e5. And then later on, if this pawn is exchanged, even the queen can join the party after bishop d3, for example, from e2. So from e2, the queen can support e5. Even a rook, let's say either rook, could go to e1, supporting e5 as well. So that's actually very, very pleasant for white. Now that we have this structure, let's see what could happen. And here, let's say normal move is knight c6, and another normal move is knight b2 d2. And this is a little bit of a tabia. So this position has been played so many times. I personally played a lot of games in this position as well. And there's a number of things that black can do, but you really want to understand the white's plans first. Now, first of all, let me show a common mistake here. A lot of players play bishop d3 here, and this is actually a mistake. Because here, remember, we said we want to play c3 so that the queen can go to b3. But now, after something like queen b6, queen b3 is not really ideal. We're not losing a piece because after c4, we can still take the queen. But this is not very, very pleasant for white. So we don't really want to play this. We're forced to exchange queens, and now black has got a very comfortable position. Black will continue with b5 and so on. So make sure you don't make this mistake of developing this bishop too early. You actually want to play knight b d2 first. Now it's a lot safer to play something like bishop d3, because you have a lot of other ways to defend this pawn, and queen b2 is no longer as dangerous as it was before with the knight on b1. Because remember, with the knight on b1, if the queen takes on b2, the rook is attacked. Now this rook is free to move. Rook b1 is even a possibility, but again, not the only one. And queen c2 is also possible in some lines. But right now, what black would normally play here is either bishop e7 or bishop d6. These are really the two main moves. Other moves are possible, but not really very, very common at all. So these are the main two moves. Why? Because black wants to castle. So black wants to castle as soon as possible, so developing this bishop makes a lot of sense. And bishop d6 actually considered the main line, whereas bishop to e7 it's not the main line, and here white gets a very comfortable play. Now, against this bishop e7, there's a number of different ways that white can play. Traditionally, white used to play with h3, and this is because there's another very key idea in this system. Black sometimes wants to go after this bishop. So a move like knight h5, for example, would immediately attack this bishop. And normally, this bishop has got some resources to avoid problems. For example, here, this bishop can go to g5, and after a move like bishop e7, for example, we can take, and we've exchanged the bishop, and this knight is slightly misplaced, and we have not exchanged the bishop for the knight, but for the other bishop, so we didn't give up the bishop pair, which is very important. But after a move like bishop e7, for example, now after knight h5, bishop g5 is no longer possible. So a lot of players here used to play h3. However, after h3, black found a way to respond, which is bishop d6. And now there's a slight problem in this position. The slight problem is that we actually cannot retreat, but we have to take this bishop. Now you may be thinking, why are you talking about retreating? And the idea is very, very simple. If you consider the main line, which is bishop d6, which we'll cover in just a moment, here the main move for white is to go back. It's not the only move. Once again, you can take and it's playable. You can leave the bishop where it is and it's also playable, but retreating this bishop is very good, because now if black takes, then you can take with the pawn and open up this file, which is quite pleasant, gives some nice pressure for white. And if black doesn't do anything, then we still have control of this diagonal, and this queen is still tied to the defense of this bishop, so this queen can't really go to b6 or anything like that until this tension here is resolved. So that's extremely important as well. And again, this only works because there's a pawn on h2, and therefore if bishop takes, we take with the h pawn, opening up the file. This is no longer possible after bishop e7. So here I don't really recommend h3. Again, it's playable, because at least you get a tempo versus the variation where you take or even ignore the bishop and just let your opponent capture an f4. But here, what white usually do is either knight e5, immediately going after this weakness on e5, because hey, you know what, now this bishop is not going to d6. So remember, we say the e5 square is so important. If this bishop is not fighting for the square, let's just occupy that with the knight immediately. Or white can actually prepare that, can play bishop d3, and then later on knight e5. and in the future even move like h4. Now the reason knight e5 is preferable though is because now the knight h5 is no longer possible. So this problem that we have, okay, so the reason we were playing h3 was to avoid knight h5 and having to go somewhere with the bishop that was an h2. Right now, after knight e5, we immediately control this h5 square. So this knight a5 is actually a very good move and solves a lot of problems. So once again, the other moves are playable, but lead to a slightly different type of position as well. So bishop d3 is playable, and h3 is playable as well. But this is what my recommendation is here. And the way the game may continue, now of course this is by no means forced, but if you look at the general plans for white here, after black castles, all of a sudden white doesn't really need to castle. It is possible to castle after a normal move like bishop d3. It's actually possible to castle, but it's not the only way to play. And if we just have a look at this position, a lot of other things are possible. For example, this king is starting to feel a little bit in danger. Black can continue if black continues with moves that are not extremely testing. So if black doesn't take the knight or doesn't put in more pressure, let's say black plays a6 to continue with b5, for example, trying to develop this bishop somewhere, so something very slow. We can continue in a number of different ways, but castle is perfectly possible, of course. But an interesting way to play is queen f3. Now after queen f3, we add in some control to e4, but more importantly, we're preparing to swing this queen over to h3 and start putting a lot of pressure, because there's almost a mate threat here on h7, and only this knight is defending. If we find a way to dislodge this knight from the f6 square with a move like knight g4, for example, even bishop g5 in some lines, then it actually becomes quite difficult for black to play. Another move that is possible is even h4. After h4, if this knight tries to go to d7, which is something that, it's probably possible sometimes, all of a sudden black needs to be extremely careful about potential sacrifices here. Now, right now the sacrifice doesn't work yet, but this is an idea that is extremely important. So right now the reason it doesn't work is after king takes, queen takes, king g8, we actually not in time here to go for mate because of knight f6, and knight g5 doesn't really come in time. But if this knight somehow disappears, so say for example we play a few more moves and black is no longer able to play knight f6 there, then this becomes a real possibility. So I'm just showing you the idea. I'm not recommending this to play this in this particular move order, but I'm showing an idea that can become very, very dangerous. And again, as we mentioned, a very simple plan with queen f3, queen h3, and then even moves like g4 are possible, g4, g5, to actually once again dislodge this knight and continue the attack. In the future, this rook may join the attack as well after h4, and rook h3, rook g3, and so on. So very, very dangerous for black to play this type of positions. If black doesn't know what he's doing, can get in trouble very quickly, whereas for white, it's not really easy to get in trouble. The king is very safe. Whether we castle the king or we leave the king in the center, either way, in these positions, the king is extremely safe. But let's have a look at the other way for black to play, which is bishop to d6. And now, as I mentioned before, we want to go to g3 and just keep this tension. It's not the only move. There's other possible moves I mentioned. You can ignore that and just leave the bishop where it is, and just simply, in the future, let's say we play bishop d3, and black can take, and we can take. And this is playable for white because we play knight e5. Once again, we still have support for this particular square here in e5, which is our strong square, as we mentioned, because of the situation that was defined on move 2. But right now, we don't really need to get into that. It's considered better to just retreat the bishop to g3. And again, black will probably not take. Sometimes, actually, especially at lower level, people will just take here. But, after takes, this pressure can actually be really, really nice. So, especially higher levels, normally black will not take. Black will just castle, for example, or play some other moves. But then at some point, we'll castle anyway. So, the game we usually transpose. And then here we can continue. There's many ideas. Bishop b5 is an idea, but bishop d3 is the simplest way to play. And here, again, there's a lot of different ways to play. b6 is considered the main line. Just to give you an understanding of the possible plans that are possible here. After b6, there are multiple moves that are possible. Knight e5 is playable, we played it many times. And one of the idea of knight e5 is that we want to continue with moves like f4, bishop h4, look to exchange this knight for this bishop, then continue with g4, g5, h4. And once again, the queen can swing over f3 and h3, and this attack can be very dangerous. The queen can even go to b1 in some lines and keep attacking over here. So knight e5 is a possible way to play this. Another possible way to play is simply to go for e4. And the reason we decide to go for e4 is because now black will have to spend the tempo to get this bishop out of the way with bishop e7. And then we can keep pushing, which is not the only move, but it's a possibility. We can keep pushing, and the game may continue like this. And here, once again, there's a couple of moves that are possible. And we're not going to go too much in detail, but I can show you already that we have a very nice pawn chain pointing towards the black king, which means that, yes, that's exactly our plan, attacking the black king. And look at how safe our king is. So once again, this is one type of opening where it's actually very hard to get checkmated in the opening, but it's not unlikely that you will checkmate black pretty quickly, especially if black is not a very good defender. So a very, very nice way to play. Now, as you can see, there's a lot of transpositions in the opening. There's a lot of different ways to achieve this type of position. And again, black might postpone c5. Black might just start playing, I don't know, for example, bishop here first, and only then, say, castles, and after this move, then go c5. So this is possible, but in reality, it all amounts to the same position at the end. And okay, there's some slight alternatives. Black might go queen c7, queen e7, or doing something completely different. But ultimately, this is the idea. We have a strong square on e5. We want to put a piece on that square. If black tries, for example, say after bishop d3, black tries to go queen to e3, queen to e7 with the idea of pushing e5, because now there's a lot of control over e5 if black is in time to push. Or similarly, instead of queen e7, if rook e8 as well, then you really want to occupy the square. So remember, before black is able to play e5, you want to occupy e5 so that this square is ours. You want to make sure you claim control over the e5 square no matter what. That's extremely important in the London system, and that's the beauty of it, because it's actually possible for white to do that without having to concede that. So in this position, by far, knight e5 is considered the best move. And again, you don't need to memorize this position. So say here black plays rook e8. You know what? Knight e5, same comment. You're just playing following principle. So if you're not a professional player, if you don't have 12 hours a day to devote to chess, you really don't need to spend a lot of time in chess learning new opening variations if you play the London system, because it's so simple. It's based on ideas, strong square on e5, the bad bishop outside the pawn chain, simple thematic attack over the king side, and so on. So pawn to f4, some Stonewall-like idea, but with a lot of activity and a quick attack. So very, very simple key ideas. And of course, it takes some practice. Of course, you will probably lose some games at some point. But once you master the principles, you'll be able to navigate new positions, even if you've never seen them before. And that's not the case for a lot of other openings where you actually have to memorize variations. And you know what? If one new line is discovered, then the entire evaluation of the whole opening can change. That's something that is not going to happen in the London system, because there's so many ways to play, but it's so similar. And at the end, there's always different move orders that can allow white to get a very pleasant game. So this was an initial introduction on the London system. Once again, it's a great opening. I played a lot of very interesting games against very strong players, some grandmasters, and many other title players. And I'll be showing you some of these games in some of the future videos. And if you enjoyed the London system, if you would like to know more about this opening, by all means, let us know. So leave a comment in this video, and we'll point you to the right direction. There's a couple of links underneath this video as well. So if you want to find out more information on how to play the London system, whether you're a beginner or maybe you are a more advanced player and you want to find a reliable opening with white to get very good attacking games, but even positionally sound games, then the London system is definitely the opening for you. So thank you so much for watching this video. My name is Daniel Priya, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next video.